Welcome back. We're going to continue with our program on essential skills for supervisors and managers. And after that last session, leaders, right? That should have been in our title clearly. And our next topic is going to focus on communication and how to communicate with a diverse workforce. And so the perfect person for that is Stephanie Sweeney. She is communications consultant at eGage. And so Stephanie's passion is really about helping leaders build their competence and their confidence. She designs performance-oriented learning programs that build skills aligned with strategic business goals so that leaders can then effectively communicate critical time-sensitive information. So the work that she can explain more about this, but my understanding is that the work that you do, Stephanie, for clients is really focused on instructional design, right, and leadership training. And so how to really develop a robust communications program. So welcome, Stephanie. We're thrilled to have you here. Do you want to start sharing your slides?
Thank you. I will do that right now. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I'm really pleased to be with everyone here today. And what a great presentation to follow up. Bob's presentation was really wonderful. And you're going to see that I'm actually going to reflect a lot of his key points in my presentation as well. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit more about me, although Diane did a really great job kicking that off too. My first job was in purchasing. And after a couple of years, I became the person that they'd always sit new people with for onboarding. I realized that I really enjoyed developing people. So I shifted to human resources, where I have spent the rest of my career in learning, development, and internal employee communications. Like many of you, I would guess, family is the most important thing in my life and how I primarily define who I am. I am happily married to Ryan, a software engineer, and we have two amazing daughters. Kate is 25. She lives in Denver, and she's an environmental engineer. And Megan is 13 and just started 8th grade, where she enjoys dance and field hockey. We are actually working to visit all 50 states together, and I am the only one who has ever been to Connecticut, and that was for work. So please feel free to send me any travel tips about your great state. And Scarlett is our Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Of course, pets count as family. You might think that we spelled her name wrong since there's only one T in her name, but the reason for that will become apparent shortly. So professionally, I am on year 33 in the workforce, and I partner with all organizational levels. I do have a real passion working with new supervisors and managers, leaders, because as you heard Bob say earlier, this is one of the most significant career transitions, going from an individual contributor who does the work to a leader who motivates others to successfully do the work. I have worked in retail, finance, and banking, but most of my career has been in logistics, transportation, and supply chain industries, which I find fascinating, first of all, because it's really that behind the scenes engine that gets all the things that we need, our food, our clothing, our phones, where we need them, when we need them. And also because my favorite thing to do on vacation is a factory tour. So if you know any good ones in Connecticut, let me know, and I will include those in our travel itinerary. What motivates me, as you heard Diane say, is making it easy for others to succeed on the job. So I try to do this by sharing knowledge and resources so people feel, just like she said, more competent and more confident in their roles, whether that's functional knowledge, technical training, or leadership skills. Ohio is home to me. I was actually born in Alabama, but I grew up in a small town where both of my parents are from in Ohio. I went to school at Miami University of Ohio, which is the original Miami, where I majored in marketing. And my dog Scarlett is spelled with one T in honor of scarlet and gray, the colors of the Ohio State Buckeyes. And just finally, another little tidbit, this year I started practicing Tai Chi, which I really enjoy for both its mental and physical health benefits. My teacher says it takes 10,000 times to become a master. So I'm getting there. I only have about 9,950 times to go. So that's a little bit about me. Let me tell you about the firm that I work with, eGage. eGage is a national human resources and safety consulting firm that's based in Connecticut, where our proprietor lives. We support many types of industries, including small to mid-sized organizations, and we focus on helping businesses tackle their most pressing people issues with fully customized solutions that ensure growth, compliance, and peace of mind. We actually have a national team of employment attorneys, leadership coaches, and human resources and safety professionals that specialize in transformation and change management and guiding organizations to achieve tangible results. So if you'd like to learn more about eGage, please feel free to reach out or take a look at our website, egage.net. Here you can see today's agenda, and we're going to talk high level about a variety of skills that can help you communicate with your team members in a diverse workforce. And honestly, all of us work in a diverse workforce unless you truly only work alone. So you'll see some of these topics do reinforce some of the things you just heard Bob share with you. And my hope today is that you can learn new ideas, skills, tips, and tools, apply those learnings on the job, and then ultimately improve performance and results. Now, that's my hope, but you are accountable for all three of these steps. So it's really up to you to own your development and take action after today's sessions. Here's an idea to help you along, and that is building a very simple action plan. I encourage you, if you haven't done it already, to open up a Word document or a notes application on your phone, or have a pen and paper nearby, whatever works best for you, so that you can jot down these questions and answer them throughout today's sessions. When something resonates with you, maybe you think, hey, maybe I could try that, or that behavior isn't doing me any favors, I need to let that go, or I'm doing this today, but this gives me a new way of looking at it. I encourage you to jot that down. You may already have some things. I know Bob had a great list of best practices for coaching, and there were probably several that stood out to you from that list. Maybe you'll capture something you'd like to learn more about, or maybe you'll capture something you'd like to talk about with your supervisor to see if it's a good developmental opportunity. In any case, multiple studies show that you are over 40% more likely to achieve your intentions and goals by writing them down. So I will be referring back to this plan throughout the session and just kind of reminding you to think about, is there anything we're talking about here that is an opportunity for you? So let's dive into today's topics and start with the basics. What is the definition of communication? This one is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and I'll give you just a quick minute to read it over. I like that this definition talks about both verbal and nonverbal communication. And I also really like that it mentions behavior as a type of communication. For example, if you communicate with your team via email and you send them an email after hours or on the weekend, well, one message they're going to receive is whatever you actually wrote. They may also receive the message from your behavior that you expect them to be online when they are away from work. And maybe that's not a message you intended to send. So consider your actions as another communication channel. When you think about what you do all day, I bet much, if most of your time is spent on communicating, whether that is conversations, email, text, telephone, instant message, or even just your body language. And that's because communication impacts so much of our lives, both personally and at work. Here are just some of the things that communication affects at work. And when I was putting this slide together, honestly, there was not much I could think of that communication doesn't impact. This slide is by no means exhaustive. I left some blank spaces because I'm sure you can think of other things from your specific industry or workplace. These are just some general items that apply to most of us as leaders. And actually, let me take a minute to clarify what I mean when I use the term leader. I don't necessarily mean that you have direct reports. Leadership is a skill, not a title, and we have leaders that exist at all levels of every organization. So back to the slide, as you look over these items, I think we'd all agree that we want to strengthen these. We want more engagement. We definitely want it more after hearing how crucial it is from Bob's presentation earlier. We want greater innovation. We want faster decision making. And in fact, you may have some of these items on your performance reviews, like productivity or retention. So effective communication really is a hallmark of successful leaders and successful organizations. So what do I mean when I say effective communication? Well, first, I mean the message is received. So in this example, where it's being delivered in person verbally, it's actually heard. But it could mean the message came into my inbox, it didn't go to spam, I could read it, or maybe I saw the message if it was something that we posted on a bulletin board in our office. So depending on the delivery method, this may look different, but it means that the message was received. Okay, I got the message. The next step of effective communications means I understand the message as it was intended. There's no misinterpretation, and it makes sense to me as the recipient. That's not all, though. So then I now know what action I need to take, if any, as a result of the communication. And then, of course, I actually do take that action. And then, most importantly, throughout the process, the communication happens with respect. Not all communication is positive, but all messages can be delivered in a way where people feel appreciated. And when all of this comes together, that's when the magic happens. So let's dig into some tips and tools to help you communicate more effectively. So when we think about communication, the tendency is to focus on what we're saying or writing, the message that we are delivering. But listening is just as important. In fact, you'll see online in lots of studies, there's a common ratio of 80-20 rule, and that says that in effective communications, 80% of your time is spent listening, and only 20% you delivering the message. So let's talk about 4 different types of listening. And that first type is passive. So passive listeners are not giving their full attention to what's being communicated. They may hear your main points, maybe, but not much else. And Bob talked about this earlier. So they may nod along and say things like, got it. So you aren't entirely aware of their actual lack of attention, but you see them typing on their laptop. So you know they're not getting everything that you're saying. I will mention, though, passive listening is actually the most common form of listening, and we all do it, whether it's during a dull meeting, or if you're having a conversation with someone that you don't really connect with, or even when you're in conversation with a loved one, if you're feeling distracted or stressed. So it's just important to be aware that this type of listening does exist, and you're going to come across it, and you're going to do it. So selective listening, if you're not a selective listener, you've probably had an experience with one. Selective listeners filter messages through their own worldview, so they only hear what they want or expect to hear. They lean into their own beliefs, their own thoughts, their own feelings, to the point where they only hear the information that they agree with, or that they're most interested in, or that they think is actually relevant to them. So often a selective listener will miss important details or misunderstand the message. An active listener is just that. That is an active participant in the conversation and the message. So listening actively is effective because you're not only thoroughly listening to what's being communicated, you're engaging with that message too. You're asking questions. You're offering input and insight. You stay on topic, and you use body language that shows that you're open to what the other person is saying, whether or not you agree with them. And this is a great place to be as a listener. There is actually, though, one more level that can kind of boost up active listening just a little bit, and that is being an empathetic listener. So when you're an empathetic listener, you're still listening actively and you are engaging with the conversation. And you're also paying attention to the emotion behind what is being said. So this is where you put yourself in the other person's shoes and you understand how they are feeling, whether or not you agree with that feeling. Listening with empathy can really build a powerful connection and help the other person feel valued and understood and supported at work. So, what are some things that you can do to listen actively? And as we go through this list, if any of these points are opportunities for you, then I encourage you to add those to your action plan. The first one is be present. And Bob talked about this too. Put down your phone, close your laptop, take the conversation off the loud factory floor or busy sales floor, and quiet your own internal dialogue that wants to think about things like, can we hurry this up? I have a really long to-do list today, or what am I going to have for lunch? Then look beyond what is being said. 65% of communication is non-spoken. The nonverbals can be yours. Are you making appropriate eye contact with the other person? Are you nodding when it makes sense? Are you leaning in a way that's genuine and non-threatening? And pay attention to their nonverbals. Are they talking fast? Maybe they're nervous. Asking open-ended questions is important to show that you're interested in what they're saying, to keep the conversation flowing, and also to clarify the information. As leaders, we often feel pressured that we have to have all the answers. And it's okay for you to ask things in a conversation like, what have you tried? What would you do differently next time? What do you think is the best path moving forward? Then after the other person has spoken, tell them what you heard without judgment. This active listening technique makes sure that you've captured their thoughts, their ideas, and their emotions accurately. And it also helps the other person feel validated and understood while minimizing any potential miscommunication. You can summarize what you've heard and give the other person the opportunity to say whether you've captured their meaning or their intent. For example, you might say something like, I'm hearing that you're frustrated about this situation. And they may say, yes, exactly. Or no, that's not at all what I meant. And then you can keep the conversation going and ask questions to clarify as necessary. Patience is also a really important active listening technique because it allows the other person to speak without interruption. And this can be really tough because we're all busy and many of us are overscheduled during the workday. And also, silence can be uncomfortable for some of us. And full disclosure, this was a big challenge for me personally when I was new at giving feedback. And I would have definitely added that to my personal action plan. So don't try to fill a pause in a conversation when the other person is speaking with your own thoughts and stories. And give them time to process when you ask a question before replying or jumping in. Patience also means listening to understand, not respond. And what that means is don't prepare your reply in your mind while the other person is still speaking, or you may miss important details. Sometimes when we're practicing active listening, we may receive criticism. And Bob talks about this too, and he's right. This can be challenging because it's human nature for us to want to be right in our choices and our actions. But if someone could make you a better coworker, supervisor, or friend, wouldn't you want that? So think of receiving feedback, even if it's constructive feedback, the same way that you think of receiving a gift. It may not be the exact gift you want, since it's not always easy to hear constructive feedback. You can still, though, appreciate the other person making the effort. Receiving feedback does not have to be painful. Here are some guidelines to help you receive that feedback as a gift. And again, think about whether any of these are appropriate for your action plan. So first, all the tips we covered earlier about active listening come into play when you're receiving feedback. Be present, Focus on the message that's being delivered rather than thinking about your response. Ask questions when you need clarification. Reflect back what you hear to make sure you understand, and be patient. Don't respond or interrupt with a defensive response. And remember your nonverbals. So this is especially important if that feedback is constructive. No one should be giving you feedback to hurt your feelings, and your responses should mirror that same standard. So be open-minded, try not to take it personally, and remember feedback is about making you better. When you show consideration and respect to the other person, it helps build trust. And when someone does tell you something, you may not be able to see that in your behavior, but it's kind of like having spinach stuck in your tooth. It's there even if you don't see it. So take time to digest the information so you can be a little more objective. No one wants to receive vague feedback, like you need to be a better team player. Feedback should describe specific behaviors. So if you're not clear about what's being addressed in a feedback conversation, then you can ask for examples. And a great way to start that is, can you tell me when? So can you tell me when I could have been a better team player? Is a good question to ask the other person. And then thank the other person for the feedback, just as you would thank anyone giving you a gift. Even if you have different viewpoints about the same situation, keep in mind they are telling you how they experienced your actions. You may choose not to do anything differently as a result of the feedback. You can still thank them for taking the time to have the conversation. You can even say something like, thanks, I really need to think about this. And if I have any more questions, can I follow up with you later? And remember, as we said earlier, the purpose of feedback is not to make you feel bad. It's about improvement and growth. Not everyone is great at delivering it, and there's definitely a difference between constructive feedback and a personal attack. However, even when that feedback comes with positive intent, it can stir up emotion in us. So let's talk about some strategies you can use if that happens to you. We are all individuals, and different people react differently to the same information. So I talked a little earlier and said I had two children. My oldest is ultra sensitive. My youngest is not as sensitive. Neither one of them like to clean their room. And they had very different reactions at 13 years old to me saying, your room is getting messy, please straighten it up today. My oldest apologized and got teary. My youngest rolled her eyes at me and just told me to close the door and stop looking at it. So neither reaction is right or wrong. And that is the same if you have an emotional reaction at work. So first, recognize and acknowledge your emotions and know that it's okay for you to feel angry, hurt, or sad. While these emotions are natural and valid, they can also cloud your judgment and prevent you from responding appropriately. So next, reset. Take a deep breath and reframe your thoughts if necessary before you react. Instead of thinking this feedback is unfair and wrong, you can think this feedback is challenging to hear and it may be helpful. Our minds and our bodies are definitely interconnected. So if you're expressing that emotion with a fast heartbeat or a red face because you're angry, or maybe you're getting teary and crying, you can acknowledge that in the conversation. You can say something like, I'm having an emotional reaction because this is difficult for me to hear, but I'd like to keep going. Or you can even say, I'd like a few minutes to regain my composure. And then remember again, feedback is not a judgment of your self-worth. It's a tool to help you achieve your goals and advance your career. So be resilient and don't let the conversation define you. Focus on the future and what, if anything, you want to change as a result of that feedback. You could also connect with your support system to help your resilience, whether that's a work friend, a family member, or your pet. So what if you're giving the feedback and the other person gets emotional? We're going to talk about that in our next topic, which is goal-oriented and compassionate feedback. What do I mean by this topic? Well, goal-oriented means the feedback that you give is aligned with the recipient's goals, so they see the relevance and value of your feedback and how it can help them achieve their desired outcomes. Compassionate means that the feedback is honest and direct and also understanding and supportive. So this slide to me answers the basic question, what is feedback? And Bob talked about this too. When you give feedback, you share information and insights into someone's past performance and behavior with the goal of improving future actions. And here are two feedback examples. Both of them are giving perspective on past performance. I'm going to give you a quick minute to read them, and I'd like for you to think about whether one example seems more effective to you, and if so, why. So my guess is you all probably thought example 2 was the more effective feedback model, and you're right. And if you didn't think that, I'll talk about why example 2 is. So first we have an observation. And again, the observation is what you have seen or heard. And I'd like you to notice that it's more specific in example 2 than it is in example 1. Then we have the impact of what you observed. So the effect of their behavior. And in example 1, we had a judgment, not an impact statement. You don't know whether they care about showing up to work on time. That could be true, but it is not a factual impact that you know for sure. So really, to me, this is the simple feedback formula: observation plus impact. Your observation includes specific facts about what you observed and when. And the impact is the effect that behavior had, whether it's on other team members, on your customers, on your business results, or on your safety, or you can probably think of other standards for your workplace or your industry. Here are the skills that you can use to give feedback compassionately. Again, think about if any of these might be helpful to your own action plan. And I know Bob talked about a lot of these, so I'm going to run through them a little quickly. But as he mentioned, you want to be timely so that they can take immediate action to improve. Continuous just means giving feedback regularly, and then it becomes expected by your team members, and it's not such a big deal. It also keeps people engaged and on track to meet their goals, and it builds trust, and it makes it easier for you every time because you're building that rapport with the other person. Especially if you're giving feedback to a peer or even your boss, you might want to think about asking for permission. You can say something like, would you mind if I gave you some feedback? Or could I share an observation? And then remember, behavior is observable, measurable, and changeable. Personality is much more internal and difficult to change. And we'll talk more about that a little later. Some sample questions that investigate are things like, what have you accomplished so far? What do you think caused this? Some sample questions that empower. What could you do next? What resources do you need? You'll notice when I give example questions, those open-ended questions, I try to stay away from starting them with why. Sometimes it's appropriate, but sometimes it can feel a little accusatory. Just instead of saying, why did you do that? And if you said, you know, what choice did you make, or what do you think caused that? It doesn't kind of have that accusatory nature that starting with why does. We've talked about empathy already, understanding the other person's feelings. Just remember, empathy is different from sympathy. You're agreeing with and validating those feelings if you're showing sympathy. In empathy, you're just recognizing and understanding the way the other person feels. And finally, abstaining from being the problem solver can encourage ownership, accountability, and buy-in. So having regular feedback discussions is one way to build and maintain credibility. Why is credibility important at work? Well, credibility means that you're respected and trusted by others. And when you have this quality, you can work more efficiently and effectively, and it helps your own career advancement too. So what are behaviors that enhance your credibility? Let's run through this list. First, we have acting with integrity, which means that you're honest and trustworthy. You follow company policies and you have a good work ethic. I'm sure you're going to see some strengths that you have on this list. Again, think about that action plan. Are there any opportunities? Being respectful means that you treat everyone with dignity, courtesy, and kindness, regardless of their job title. Authentic leaders know themselves and are genuine and sincere. So you take actions that align with your values. You can certainly learn from other people and mentors, but you shouldn't strive to mimic or act just like them. People can tell when you're not being authentic. Reliability means keeping promises, meeting deadlines, being punctual. If you know you won't be able to meet a commitment, be honest and let the other party know as soon as possible, and come with a plan for when and how that commitment can be met. Consistent leaders provide predictability, which can make employees feel safe and less stressed compared to a leader who changes their mind often and acts unpredictably. Being competent means that you have the skills you need to do your job well. And it also means that you're always learning and improving. You're curious. You're asking questions if you don't know the answer. You don't guess or assume. Transparent leaders share information, and you're open to ideas and input from others. Now, of course, the amount of transparency will vary by situation. You can't always share everything with your team. But when you do share knowledge and information, you build trust and credibility. And finally, celebrate others for their efforts, for their successes, and even for maybe just stepping outside of their comfort zone and trying something new. And of course, make sure you give credit where credit is due. And one of the greatest actions that you can take to maintain credibility is owning up to a mistake. This is not always easy, especially if you're a new leader. When this happens, the first step is to take a minute and forgive yourself. It is natural to feel embarrassed or even distressed if you make a mistake, but we all make mistakes. So you want to focus on the actions that you can take to move forward. And that means being really clear and specific about what the mistake was and taking responsibility for your actions. You can keep it brief. You can say something like, hey, Ryan, I made a mistake on the units per hour calculation on today's report, and I'm working to correct that as soon as possible. Then have a solution plan ready and follow up on it. And finally, take a minute to reflect on what happened and why. What can you do differently to decrease the chance of that mistake happening again? Owning up to mistakes isn't always easy, but it does show that you're being transparent and accountable. And it helps your team members see that it's okay to make mistakes. It is just part of being human. Another part of being human is making decisions, something that we do every day in both our personal and our professional lives. Effective decision-making is when you select the best course of action from several alternatives. And at work, making good decisions can help increase productivity, improve trust, and achieve your business goals. So let's walk through the decision-making process. In the first step, you discover an issue and you determine the circumstances that led to the situation. So it's very important when you're making a decision to get to the root cause at the beginning. So you're solving for the actual cause of the issue. For example, if you're making a decision between two different new formats for a report at work, that may not be the issue at all, the format of the report. If the report information isn't actually useful, or if the report isn't going to the right audience. Then, after you learn more information about the issue, you're going to devise several possible options. And in this step, it can be very valuable to involve others where appropriate for their expertise and to gain their buy-in. This can be really valuable if you have any skeptics on your team, to involve them early in the decision-making process and get their issues laid out right in the beginning so you can build those options around them. Then you weigh your options. You analyze the advantages and the disadvantages of each option, and you explore alternative solutions if needed. When you're making a decision, it can be really helpful to refer back to your team's strategy, your mission statement, if you have one, your team's values, if you've defined those, and make sure that your options and choices are in alignment with those things. It's also really important when you're making a decision to think about both short-term and long-term impact. Something may seem like a quick, easy fix in the short term, but it may make sense to take the extra effort or even spend a bit more to come out ahead in the long term. And then finally, you make a choice and you take action. And during this step, it's really important to think about your stakeholders. Who does your decision impact? And don't forget to inform key partners of that decision, the reasoning behind it, any partnership you're going to need from them, and anything you're going to ask them to do differently as a result of that decision. I do want to take a minute and talk about contingency planning too during decision making. This can be really helpful because it helps to identify potential risks and get ahead of them with a proactive action plan. So this way, even if things take an unexpected turn, you can minimize the disruption. There are a lot of contingency planning templates out there if you Google and search, but at their heart, they all include kind of 4 basic elements. And first is just thinking about what are the risks if you take this course of action. So think about what realistically could happen and think about that from a technical perspective, a process perspective, and an employee, a people perspective. And then think about the probability of the risk actually happening. You're going to want to focus your efforts more on risks where the probability of occurrence is high. Preparation is all about what you can do in advance. So for example, let's say that you decide to implement a new automation tool to speed up a manual process in your workplace. Well, one risk could be resistance from your employees to adopt that new tool. Could you schedule some upfront training sessions where they can practice the tool without the pressure of a live environment? And then response is what action you will take if that risk actually does occur. So back to rolling out a new automation tool, one risk could be a technology failure. Could you still go back to the old manual method temporarily? Formal contingency planning and building out a grid is certainly not necessary for all decisions that you make, but it can save you both time and money when you're implementing a major decision that involves things like new technology, new equipment, or significant new process changes. When you make a decision, it often needs to be communicated to your team members. And there are a lot of other things that we communicate regularly. For me, things like business performance, strategic priorities, just work assignments to individuals every day, instructions on new processes. I'm sure you can think of many more in your work environment. So communicating with clarity is crucial so that your team understands the message and takes the necessary actions. When communication is unclear in the workplace, it can have many negative effects, including confusion, where people are not clear on what you're saying. And really, confusion is probably the root cause of many of the other impacts on this slide, including things like making assumptions about what actions they should take or what your expectations are, which can then lead to mistakes if they do the wrong thing or they're unfocused. And worst case scenario, those mistakes may result in an accident or an injury. When people are confused, it can certainly lead to missed deadlines, both because they just may not know what the deadline is, or they may not understand what they need to do to meet it. Reduced productivity is another consequence of unclear communications because it's difficult for people to understand objectives and take the right actions if they're wondering, what should I do? Or if they're spending time kind of debating it and trying to figure it out with their peers. And unclear communication can also cause people to feel unmotivated and disengaged and even produce mediocre work. And that can, of course, lead to low morale. So to communicate clearly, here are some tips. Have that action plan ready on your phone or paper or Word document in case anything stands out to you as a personal opportunity. And the biggest thing, I think, is investing the time to plan your message. Know your audience and tailor your message so that it will be clear and easy for them to understand. If you have a message that's going to be delivered, the same message by multiple leaders, for example, if in your workplace you have multiple offices or you have different shifts in your factory, you might want to consider preparing some talking points or some guidelines for your leaders who are going to be delivering that message, so you can make sure that it's consistent to everyone. You should also think about the effect that message is going to have on your audience as a type of contingency planning, like we talked about before. And is there anything you can do proactively to address potential concerns that your team may have? This is also where you should think about your communication channel. Are you going to send the message on email? Are you going to hold a team meeting in person? Should you have a copy of the message in writing to hand out so people can take it with them and digest it on their own time? Should you use visual aids to help get the message across? These are all things that you want to think about in advance that can help set you up for success. Then you want to use simple language. In every communication channel, simplicity is best. Get to the point. Avoid using jargon that your audience might not understand. And make sure everyone is clear on the personal impact to them. We all care about that if we're receiving a message. What's in it for me? What's the impact to me? So make sure that they're clear about what that impact is, what's expected of them, what actions, if any, they need to take. And finally, don't assume that communication is one and done. Well, I sent the email. We had the meeting at the start of the shift. Everybody was there. If you shared an important message during a group meeting like that at the start of your shift, especially if it requires your team to take a certain action, you might want to consider following up one-on-one with your team to make sure that they understood it and to answer any questions they have. There were probably some passive listeners in your team and some selective listeners too, filtering out. So take the time to observe them in action and give them feedback to course correct if necessary. And let's close the session by talking about leading and working with diverse teams. I said earlier that unless you work alone, you have a diverse team. So just for a couple minutes, or not a couple minutes, a few seconds, just think about your team. What are the ways your team is diverse? And you probably thought of a few things, but most of the factors that make up diversity and make us who we are actually not visible things. So if you just look at me here on my screen chatting with you, and we went no further than that, you might not think that we have very much in common. So let's test this out. I'm going to just call out a few characteristics about myself. And as you listen, if you hear something that you connect with, just make a hash mark on that piece of paper or count them on your fingers. So I am a parent. I am a pet owner. I have close relatives who are Korean. I play fantasy football. I like order and routine. I crack my knuckles. I work on a computer most of the day. I am lactose intolerant. I need quiet time to recharge. So most of those things you wouldn't know if you just saw my picture. or just listen to me during this presentation. But my guess is that many of you found one or more connections with me that you may not have known about. Connections are not always apparent. And it's important as leaders to be willing to ask for and share information with others and find those connections. This is really one of the best ways for you to strengthen relationships and build trust on your diverse team. And let's go a little deeper into the concept of diversity. I know there's a lot going on this slide, but I really like this graphic. The diversity wheel is the way that I refer to this. It illustrates 4 layers of diversity, starting with the circle in the center. And that's personality. This is the essence of who we are. It's what makes you, your individuality. It is formed by both your genetic makeup and your environment and the experiences that you've had throughout your life, nature and nurture. It's things like, are you more outgoing or reserved? Are you more structured or flexible? Each one of us has a unique personality. The next layer, that darker blue layer, are internal dimensions. These are things that may be visible, but can't typically be changed. They are the characteristics that people usually think about when they're thinking about diversity. And I saw some of you typed into chat, which is great, but they may be some of the ones you thought about earlier in relation to your team, probably because they are often the ones that we can see. Then we come to external dimensions that we have maybe some more control over a lot of these, but they may not be immediately obvious by looking at someone. These include areas of cultural diversity, like whether you have a New York accent, or whether you play pickleball, or your religious or social affiliations. And finally, we have organizational dimensions that refer to professional characteristics, which are certainly a component of diversity. Now, these terms may not exactly align with the ones that you use in your workplace, but they include things like union affiliation. Are you a remote employee or an on-site employee? Your job level within the organization. Are you management or frontline? What's important is every single one of us is represented on the diversity wheel. It includes all of us. So just some reflection, and you know, this is personal reflection. You don't have to type it, but just think about it. What dimensions have the most impact on how you perceive yourself on this diversity wheel? And as you think about that, kind of flipping that a little bit, which ones do you think have the most impact on the way others perceive you? So for me personally, you know, one of the biggest one is for me is my parental status on how I perceive myself. I think a lot of people look at me and, you know, see maybe my age, but I don't think about that as much. So what's important here is not to have bias towards others based on these dimensions. And let's do another little exercise to dive a little deeper into that. So let's say you're giving feedback to a team member who is having this nonverbal reaction that you can see on the screen. And you don't have to type this, but I just want you to think about, what do you think this means when you're giving feedback to this woman and this is the nonverbal reaction she's having? Well, you might think she's having an emotional reaction. Maybe she's unhappy with what she's hearing, or embarrassed or anxious about the conversation, and she might be. However, she could be a person with autism. People with autism often avoid eye contact because it gives many of them sensory overload. Or it could be a cultural response. In some East Asian cultures, direct eye contact is considered confrontational and disrespectful. So what's important in working with a diverse team is there is no one right answer. When someone does this, here's what it means. If you manage them this way, it's correct. Everyone is unique. The key thing about leading a diverse team is that you cannot make assumptions. How can you know for sure what she means and what this reaction is? By getting to know her. So then you learn, what is her normal behavior? And you recognize signs when something is different, and she might be having an emotional response. So let's dive into one of the internal dimensions, age. And Bob talked a little bit about this too. Diane mentioned it as well. And this is expressed by different generations in the workplace. I know there's a lot of information on this grid. Many workplaces do have employees that cross 4 or even 5 generations. The baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z. And then the generation before the baby boomers, sometimes they're referred to as the silent generation or veteran. There's different names for that, but there's still certainly some of those folks in the workplace. We want to make sure they all feel engaged and supported. So it can be helpful to understand some of the common ins and outs of each generation. And I focus this grid on really talking about communicating with the generations. So as you review the grid, keep in mind that depending on the source, the birth years will vary a little bit. So someone born near either end of the years shown on these ranges might feel more aligned with the generation next to them, and that's fine. And the percent of workforce numbers that you see here come from a report by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2023. So just like Bob said, Gen Z is right there, right, ready to take over and be larger than baby boomers, and very soon larger than the rest of us as well. So let's talk about some of the common themes of each generation. Again, remembering what we talked about on the last slide, each one of us is an individual. So we'll start with baby boomers. Many baby boomers have a great deal of experience and are team-oriented and feel optimistic about their work. Many of them can be very highly competitive and driven, and that can lead to workaholic tendencies. Many of them prefer a traditional workplace and value responsibility and respect the authority of a management hierarchy. Many are very loyal to their employer and expect loyalty in return. Many baby boomers see work as their road to success and will make sacrifices to get where they want to be. And as far as communication goes, many baby boomers prefer direct communication and like to hear the other person's voice, whether that's in person or on the phone or a video meeting. And many baby boomers kind of find text messages and instant message more annoying than helpful. Moving on to Generation X, many Gen Xers saw their parents and their grandparents work long hours and sacrifice personal time to provide for their families and even stay loyal to companies when they felt unsatisfied. So many Gen Xers reject the idea that you have to sacrifice for success, and instead they strive for a healthy relationship with work. And while many Gen Xers are hardworking employees, many of them do not want to take their work home with them. Many Gen Xers were the first to have both parents working, so many of them can be independent and like working alone. Many Gen Xers prefer direct, informal feedback. So that could include email, text messages, or any other efficient and straightforward method. Our next group are the millennials. Millennials experience fast-paced changes and innovations as they were growing up. They are the generation that saw the internet and mobile devices introduced. And for many of them, their careers are more than a paycheck. Their lifestyle is fueled by their passions and their interests, and they want to do meaningful work. Many millennials look for companies whose goals align with their own and will choose a job based on the company's purpose and values. Many of them love having mentors, and they want real-time feedback on their performance so they know what they're doing well and where they need to improve. Many millennials appreciate regular check-ins, whether that's face-to-face or by text or email. And finally, Gen Z, sometimes called Gen Alpha or Zoomers. Gen Z is the most diverse generation in history. And while they are the smallest percent today, as we heard, they're getting bigger every day. In fact, I read a stat that 10,000 baby boomers retire every day. And us older Gen Xers are right there too, getting ready to retire. Gen Z never knew a world without the internet or a smartphone. Many of them even self-identify as digital device addicts. So keep that in mind in the workplace, where someone like me and it's in a meeting might take notes on a piece of paper or maybe on my laptop on a Word doc. A Gen Z colleague may take notes on an app on their phone. So it doesn't mean they're on Snapchat. They might really be taking notes, and you need to think about that. Social awareness is important to many Gen Z workers, and many will consider a company's stance on social issues when they decide whether to work for them or remain with them. And the oldest members of Gen Z were 23 when COVID hit. Most of them were still in school. So that really impacted their socialization. Lots of them missed important milestones like proms and graduations, and that contributed to ongoing stress and anxiety issues that many of them still experience. Many Gen Z colleagues are individualistic and prefer one-on-one communication in person or through instant messaging platforms, not phone calls or email. Again, just remember, age is one layer of our identity. There are many other dimensions on the diversity wheel that we reviewed earlier. So it's important for you to take the time to get to know them as individuals and leverage your colleagues' unique strengths. And while we're on the subject of diversity, really quickly, let me talk about inclusion, because the terms are used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Diversity describes the differences and similarities within a group, and inclusion means that everyone in that diverse group feels involved, respected, and treated fairly. And that is something that you can strive for as a leader. So how do you do that? Well, you can start by thinking about your own experience of belonging in the workplace. Can you think about a time where you didn't feel seen or heard? And what makes you feel like you belong at work? That self-awareness is important, and these questions are just a few thought starters for you to consider and maybe even include on your action plan. You can probably think of other ways to build connection within your workplace culture. That last question touches on an unconscious bias, which are judgments that we make based on past experiences or similarities we may have with other people. So think about that. And remember, all the skills we've talked about today can help you promote inclusion with your diverse teams. Active listening can help them feel more supported and validated. Clear communication can help them adapt quickly to change and work well together, and so on. And I'd like to wrap up with just something I like to share with new managers, and that is the platinum rule. We all know the golden rule, which boils down to treat others the way you want to be treated. Many of us were taught that as children and live by it. I would encourage you to think about leveling up to the platinum rule, which says to treat others the way they want to be treated. When you get to know your team members and what makes them unique, you learn how they like to work, what their goals are, what they like to do, what they're good at. And you can adapt and create an environment where they feel engaged, productive, and set up for success. So with that, just remind you to take a look at that action plan. If you wrote some things down, pick one or two to work on first. And finally, here again is the info about the HR safety consulting firm I work with, eGage. And I do want to mention, we did do a panel with many Gen Z workers. So if you'd like to learn more about Gen Z, check out egage.net. We have some blog entries and several videos. You can learn more about Gen Z workers and what motivates them. Thank you, CBIA, for the opportunity to connect with your members, and I wish you all the best as you continue on your leadership journey.
Thanks, Stephanie. We actually did have a question in the chat, and I think it had something to do with, I'm trying to scroll up to it now. It was like what did you mean by, oh yeah, what do you mean by abstaining from being a problem solver? That was something that you recommended to not do. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're trying to change a behavior of someone, let's say it's a direct report and you're a supervisor, and we can even talk about that example that I had up about a colleague who was late to work. And, instead of saying something like, you need to set your alarm clock 15 minutes earlier, and telling them what the answer is, when you can ask questions like, what do you think you could do to help make sure you arrive to work on time? And giving them the opportunity to come up with well, I could set my alarm clock earlier. Maybe that's not the answer. Maybe it's, well, I could take a different route to work, or I could prepare my lunch the day before. And all of those are great answers. But if they come up with it, then they're likely to have more buy-in and accountability, which increases the chance that they're going to be successful and deliver that.
Okay. All right. Got it. Thank you very much.
My
So thanks, Stephanie, for that. That was super helpful. Very interesting to see, like we all know that there are differences in how people communicate across like genders and ages. And so that's all really helpful. And so you can reach Stephanie at eGage. Her contact info is on that last slide.